Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for this next session, fourth session, I believe, third session, in our mini-series on imperialism. What is imperialism? Very important question, especially with the drive towards World War III that we are currently witnessing. So Matthew, tonight, we'll be taking a look at US imperialism, the nature of it, what it looks like, the role it is playing, and how the system of imperialism works in generally. Big subject, and we're gonna have about 1.5 hours, 2 hours time, but we'll be coming back to this issue throughout this mini series. So over to you. Welcome, Matthew.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to go and share this my presentation. I'm hoping everybody can see that, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Right. Okay. Thanks, comrades. It's good to see everybody, and I hope we have a decent discussion. Obviously, this is a huge subject, and I'm going to try and cover basically an overview of the system as it stands. The interesting, of course, is it's different. It's a different system, the US system, to what went before. I mean, if we look at the contrary to school textbooks and England football fans, of course, we can count Britain among the losers, one of the big losers of the two world wars, because obviously they wound up completely skinned after the First War, and then they, of course, lost their position as hegemon in the Second. So, in those terms, the British, of course, understood this very well. They tried to postpone, the First World War as desperately as they could because they knew they could only lose. The point was, obviously, then you had the US taking over. So Churchill, actually, interestingly enough, and I need to track this one down, is he actually pledged, that he understood this and pledged the British as being, subservient, in the quote special relationship to the US, that they would always follow this, and they have done. I mean, this is the point. I mean, this is all. You can see this with all the British, most British regimes anyway. Most British prime ministers have followed that, including, of course, Starmer probably more than most. As a more subservient sort of character. Anyway, so what we have, of course, is a situation where the series of structures is set up, after the Second World War. Obviously, global structures. What they call the rules-based order. There's some rules, and we can do what we like. But here's rules that we allege exist, which include, of course, the Bretton Woods system, with the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, and then the World General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, what is now the World Trade Organization, which allows the framework for control of the major parts of the world. You also, of course, have finance, the control of finance. And the world's largest banks are generally American, although, of course, now we see the rise of Chinese banks as well. But the largest banks are American. Plus, of course, very importantly, the dollar. The dollar supplants the pound as the world's trading currency, which gives the US an enormous advantage. I mean, really an enormous advantage, because obviously it means they can just issue dollars, they can print debt in dollars, and so on and so forth. It gives the possession of the world's economy, world's currency, is a huge advantage. It's almost like a tax on everybody else. It allows the hegemon enormous advantage. So you then have political domination, and I'll go through each of these. Obviously, a political domination across the world. Military domination. I mean, the US emerges from the Second World War with one of the world's largest militaries and maintains that. And then, of course, moving to communication and technology. Actually, of course, the US dominates both the world's systems of communication and the growth of the tech companies, the internet, etc., all come out of the US. Finally, of course, its opponent at the start, of course, is Stalinism, which is essentially, in political terms, a mechanism for stabilizing capitalism. And we can see that in 1945 when actually the Stalinists allow the handover, effectively, for countries like France, Italy, Greece, Vietnam or Indochina and other places, to the capitalists. In some cases like Greece, they allow the systematic butchery of their own people, like the Greek partisans, of course, were killed systematically by the British. So in those terms, when Stalinism has acted as a mechanism throughout its period, and actually even into 2007-8, it was China that actually was one of the major stabilization mechanisms for the world capitalist economy. So in those terms, that's what it's functioned as. And I'm hoping this will now move itself. Okay. Come on. Yeah,
Use your arrows on your keyboard.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my arrows to move on there. Anyway, so what you get is what they call in the global structure, say the Bretton Woods system, which is established in 1944, actually before the end of the Second World War, in a conference in Bretton Woods, which includes the establishment of the IMF and World Bank, which of course are essentially the controllers of money, particularly to the third world and so on. Money, of course, is a strange thing, as Marx points out. Of course, under capitalism is an obscure system, and social relations appear as things. Money is a social relation, quite clearly so, and obviously based on the exploitation, particularly of the working class. And so it's not, we can see an obsession with money, but in underlying that, of course, is the question of the domination and exploitation of the working class. So under that system, of course, then you have originally dollar convertibility at $35 to the ounce, which may, given the fact dollars now at, I don't know, it's over 3,000 now to the ounce, because obviously that system went down the tube. But there was originally, certainly governments were allowed to convert dollars to gold at $35 the ounce, and a set of fixed exchange rate, which existed until 1971. Obviously, as a bureaucratic control of the world, an agreement between the US and junior imperialist powers, but that was blown apart by obviously the collapse of Bretton Woods '71. Nixon decided he had to end the system as the run, effectively a run on the dollar caused by the Vietnam War and other things, and essentially that system then fell apart. At the same time, what you see is a situation, a shift away from the bureaucratic control of the working class and the position of productive economy towards finance capital, which is very important in terms of the structure. And you see, obviously, the move by Reagan, Thatcher towards basically shutting down large amounts of production, etc., in the US, UK, and other countries, and moving towards straight parasitic finance capital. But you do also have this thing, the General Agreement, GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and then the World Trade Organization, which essentially is a mechanism for running world trade and imposing rules on world trade, which of course Trump is now threatening to explode completely by imposing tariffs on everything. So it'll be an interesting unintended consequences if he does that. So you have that system, and as I say, all with the US in the centre of it, and running the world in those terms. Around that also, of course, you then have the system of trade system. As I say, dollar as world currency, which it still is. I mean, I think that obviously the notion that the dollar isn't, that is being supplanted and all this sort of thing is well overblown. As you can see, if you look at some of the graphs at the bottom, the dollar is still the world currency by a long distance. As I say, also in terms of the World Trade Organization, which of course, obviously the US does spend its time trying to extend. Particularly, obviously, Nixon's other idea, of course, is to be nice to the Chinese, which he also started. I mean, he may have been a crook, but he was a very cunning crook, him and the guys around him, and actually they went and talked to the Chinese, and that process lasted for sort of at least 20 years, in which the actual Americans, US, attempted to get the Chinese on board, and then the breach, of course, is the point at which the Chinese basically said, well, no, you guys can't take over. We're going to do what we want to do, and we're going to continue to run the system, and you guys can't actually have control. No, that's the breach. Now, the thing is, obviously, what the effect of that, of course, is that US domination. The other part of US domination, of course, is manufacturing. By the end of the Second World War, the US actually produces something in it approaching, I think it's 48% of all manufacturers in the world is produced by the US, which is an extraordinary number. Which, I mean, you can believe, obviously, because at that point, of course, the world was still pretty shattered by the war. Plus, of course, the US was untouched. Plus, of course, it was an enormous and well-resourced country. The extraordinary thing in this period, of course, is the growth of Chinese manufacturing, which has now got, as you can see in the graph at the bottom, Chinese manufacturing has overtaken US manufacturing output by value in 2012, and is now roughly double the size. The Chinese are the world's manufacturing center. Now, I mean, the equivalent, of course, was the US overtaking Britain just before the First World War, which was a portent of the decline and fall of the British domination. The US, neither the US nor the British ruling classes are particularly stupid. Might be slightly mad, but not particularly stupid. They understand what that means, and hence the reason for why the US is so keen on attempting to restrict and taking action against China, some of which is amounting to war. I mean, if you look at some of the stuff that the US has done is pretty equivalent to what was done by the US to the Japanese before the Second World War, and it's not sort of casual stuff. It's pretty much warfare type efforts. As I say, the US is the dominant financial power, and as I say, if you look at the currency shares, you can see that, and the US economy is heavily financialized in terms of the domination of finance capital, and in terms of the banks. Plus, of course, what you're also seeing in the world now, of course, with this is the rise of non-bank financial operators as well. And the problem they've got now, of course, is that basically the banks are essentially now nationalized. They're essentially required backstop by the state after 2007-8. Then all the banks were actually held up. The system was held up by the state, saying we will guarantee and bail out the banks. And we can see that in 2022-23 with Silicon Valley Bank, Credit Suisse. We can go into that if people want to discuss that. So in those terms, but you also get this is a huge rise of non-banking outfits like the private equity mob and all the rest of it. The other thing, of course, that the US uses is access to its own market, which is the biggest market in the world in those terms, as a method of control. So, I mean, people can point to the growth of the world economy and the growth of certain countries. That say South Korea, for instance, take an example, grows from a fairly backward economy to what it is now, essentially because the US grants it as a means. The US grants it access to the US market, obviously as a counter to China and North Korea. So we see this huge growth in South Korea, basically because it has access to the US market. You can see that also in Israel, actually. Obviously, militarily, the US decides to bet on Israel from 1967 onwards.
as I've covered in a previous lecture. But in the 1980s, it essentially grants the Israelis access to fairly unrestricted access to the US market as a means of subsidizing Israel. And so if you look at Israel's export-import balance, of course, like everybody else, they import the biggest imports are from China, and the biggest exports are to the US, which is basically its means of making itself work. So you can also go through into there's also a program in Africa, AGOA, in which there is certain privileged access allowed to some certain African countries they like, which is quite critical. And you see this actually, interestingly enough, in South Africa, which is part of AGOA, therefore has access to certain privileged access to the US market. And when of course the South Africans take the Israelis to the ICJ, numbers of US politicians in the Senate and so on then say, well, why are we giving these guys access to our market when they're causing us trouble? Why should we cut them off? So that's still live. So you can see that they're political. So the other thing you've got, as I say, the next thing is political domination. So interestingly enough, I mean, what you've got obviously is different to the old system of colonialism and competing colonial powers with one like the British on top. What you have is a system of a hegemon, i.e. the US, and a series of junior imperialist powers like the British and the Germans and the French and the Japanese, and so on and so forth. And these are all gathered together in G7, as we know. And of course, obviously, they have their own, as we know, I mean, countries have their own interest, and imperialist countries have their own interest, but they very definitely bow the knee to the US, and the US does not brook any particular opposition. The US obviously has the right to interfere with anybody's political system, it feels like. So you can see that, for example, you can see in recent times, Mike Pompeo, who was at the time Secretary of State for the US, and previously, of course, director of the CIA, so he knew what he was doing, talking of one Jeremy Corbyn and saying that he was unacceptable as Prime Minister to us. He's not getting in there because we're not letting him in. Doesn't matter what you do. So they finished him off. So you can see this also in terms of things like the tapping. What came out, the tapping of Angela Merkel's phone and so on and so forth, to make sure, obviously, there's clear control in those terms. You can go through any country you like, really. The US can interfere. This also, of course, it runs through to the CIA, and other such agencies. CIA, Murder Incorporated, as it's known in some parts. Obviously with a long and very bloody record, but I mean a very serious effort to interfere, to run, its operations in all sorts of countries through all sorts of agencies. I mean, the US Union Federation, the AFL-CIO, is known throughout the world as the AFL-CIA because that's what it does. It has far more it actually operates for the CIA. Rather than in the tradition of CIO, which is a genuine workers' revolt, and you can see the linkage that put together into the unions in the UK, into the Labour Party, and so on. There's a definite, and even into the likes of the SNP and other political organisations. There's a definite linkage to ensure that the politicians line up. And clearly you see this also in what's happening in the Middle East. I mean, all of these imperialist politicians have said basically that what is being done by the Israelis is not objectionable to them. That this sort of monstrosity is entirely in line with the operation of imperialism, and that these things are not, exceptional or an issue, and so on. So it's a graphic warning to everybody what kind of people you're dealing with, and who they work for. also going to, as you say coups and other methods. I mean, you've got a long history. You can go through a big long list of coups that have been run by the US. Some cases, like Indonesia, resulting in mass slaughter, of hundreds of thousands or more, and going through a whole of Latin America and so on. So you have that as a political domination. At the same time, you also have a military domination. I'll show you this slide as well. If you see this, you can see this is basically an understanding of the US military is the biggest in the world, as we know, several times bigger than everybody else's. It has bases everywhere. Although after this has been put together, this is Al Jazeera the first one in terms of looking at US military bases. Some of those bases, like the ones in Niger, they were thrown out of, but they've always started more, and so on and so forth. So you can see the scale of it in those terms. That you have this complete military domination around. Yeah, back to that one. So you have an enormous perpetual rate of wars and invasions, and we could go through. You can go through. The interesting one, actually, the one that really is a turning point, I think, in terms of the operation of the world, is 1956. Why 1956? Because obviously what you see is a conspiracy between the Israelis, the French, the British, to take on Nasser and the Egyptians. And the interesting thing about this, of course, is that the US has obviously clearly not been briefed on this, and seriously objects to these to people operating in this way, to other countries operating in this way. Basically saying, look, you guys are the old colonial powers, and you better stop now, because we run the thing, and you're not given license to do this. So the Americans basically said to the British and the French, look, you out, because otherwise we'll collapse your currencies. And they actually walked the Israelis back to their border, literally. So right, you started there, you can drive everything back there and stay there. So that in those terms, it actually marks that sort of turning point that said, well, look, we run the things, and you lot better understand that that's the case. Again, NATO. I mean, NATO, of course, comes in as a method of control, and also, of course, the cooperation across all these different countries in terms of lethality and running agencies such as the war in Ukraine, and effort, really dangerous efforts. But also you can go through the whole list, as I say. Probably the world's most sort of deathly alliance. As I say, also Israel as the key, as we can see. I mean, the key point in terms of control of the Middle East, and therefore, that the US will basically back up Israel, and despite some of the whatever issues it has with it, because obviously it requires that as a center point of its control of the area. Whether or not the current events will change that, we don't know. Finally, I think it's also links with other militaries, and obviously the US military and so on also make great efforts to get hold of militaries and wherever else, whether that in numerous countries. They offer courses, they offer joint exercises, they offer even in the the school of the Western Hemisphere, the training for torturers and basically bringing together the militaries in terms of making sure that they're subservient to US military prerogatives and so on. It's another channel. I think the final point. I'm thinking this is the final. Yeah, it is. Yeah, final point is communications and technology. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that the US actually dominates the world, the communications. If we look at it, the modern semiconductor computer was, of course, a US government operation. Was actually started. The whole thing was actually started as a US government operation. The internet actually starts as a US Department of the DARPA net, which is section of the US Department of Defense. It's actually military. It's actually a military thing. So that the whole thing is actually starts in the US and is still focused and centered in the US. At the same time, the US extracts everything that's on the net, either via the NSA in Virginia or GCHQ, which is has even less oversight. There's virtually no oversight of GCHQ. So GCHQ is a centrally integrated into the US system of extraction of information, data, etc., etc. So the entire system is essentially dominated by the US. At the same time, we look at you can see the US effort to exclude Huawei, for instance, for the Chinese telecoms company. I mean, the thing is, obviously, again, you see the problem that they've got is that the Chinese technology, being the world's great manufacturing center, of course, Chinese technology actually is overtaking that of the rest of the world. And the Chinese 5G mobile technology is actually the best in the world, but they definitely do not want it because obviously they won't concede it. They won't concede it control the system. They don't want anybody else to have a piece of that system. You have also, as I say, China is dominating now in terms of green technology. So you've got a domination of the production of lithium batteries, for instance. It's completely run. Basically, you can see the Chinese don't produce the vast bulk of the world's lithium batteries now, and the US or the Europe and so on and so forth have a little bit on the end. At the same time, you're also seeing things like the green technologies like rare earth metals are also completely. I mean, the rare earth metals are now central to all sorts of things. From anything from military technology to wind farms and so on and so forth. They're all actually now produced in China, which makes the Americans really, really paranoid. So you have the situations where you have these enormous tariffs. The US is now instituted a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles because the Chinese actually produce better and cheaper electric vehicles than anyone else. And you get the things like the CHIPS Act, Biden's CHIPS Act, which is effectively a massive subsidy to manufacturing in the US. Combined with this vast tariff, and the same thing, clearly then also feeds through into the deliberations of the EU. So we see, finally, I think the other thing is that if you look at all the world's major technology corporations, I mean, if that's Amazon or Microsoft or Apple or any of these, they're all American, apart from the ones in China. So this is the whole the thing becomes this competition between the US and China, in terms of, in world terms. So I mean, I'll finish there. I mean, what I'm trying to say here is that there's this is a full spectrum. The system of US imperialism is like full spectrum dominance, which is obviously under challenge and obviously is decaying and declining. Which is obviously makes it more dangerous, as we can see, because it's now prepared to run ridiculous wars like Ukraine or what's happening in the Middle East in order to try and preserve itself and its control of various bits of the world and direct itself towards a conflict with China, which obviously the American military has been told that it will be running a conflict with China. So yeah, okay. If you want to make contributions or ask any questions, that's great. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Could you switch off the share screen, please? Thank you. Well done. Good overview. I think good introduction to US imperialism. Lots of issues around it. So, comrades, if you have a question or would like to make a comment, please click raise hand and I can bring you in. To get the ball rolling, Matthew, perhaps we could talk about a couple of things. If you can manage to switch off.
Yeah, I'm trying to get this to cease itself. There you are. There you are.
There you go. Well done. Okay, so comrades, as I said, please click raise hand if you'd like to come in and speak. So your last point, quite important, is it? Actually, U.S. imperialism is in decline, which leads to a very fragile global situation in terms of war, and both Ukraine and Israel are part of that symptom. Both proxy wars going on. Can we discuss briefly, what do we mean by this? Nothing lasts forever. That's the one thing we can be sure of, that always stays the same. Nothing lasts forever. You described very well how British imperialism was done away with through World War I and then World War II. That was sort of part of the same effort to redistribute the world, basically, and finish British dominance of imperialism. What is different about US imperialism, firstly, and how do you get a new hegemon? I mean, we are in a transitionary period now, aren't we? We can see that with an irrational war in Ukraine, but just sort of manufacturing, etc. If you look at graphs, they don't explain who's leading the imperialist world, who's the leader in the imperialism. So China, yes, produces more, as a main manufacturer, but it's not the leading imperialist power. How does that come about? Does it have to be a war? Could it be, done differently? How do these things change? Of course, ideally, it would be the working class that finishes US hegemon imperialist power. But for that, we need to actually be organized. It doesn't look like that at the moment. But can you describe this, perhaps? How do imperialist powers, hegemons change, and what is the role of China in this scenario?
Well, obviously, we've only ever had two really. One is Britain as the world's oldest capitalist power, and the other one, in capitalist terms, is the US. So, obviously, this process has been done with, last time took 2 world wars, and the fact that by the time the second was finished, Britain was completely broken, effectively. So, in those terms, not a good precedent, but obviously, going into the current question, it then becomes this whole issue, as Marx puts up, he said, well, clearly the agency of liberation of humanity is the working class. The question is, how does it show itself in terms of organization and changing the nature of the world? Because otherwise, clearly, what we're seeing is a situation which the US can't continue to run the system as it is. Both in terms of the decline of the economy, plus, of course, there's failing bits of their control mechanisms, plus the inability of their military to deal with the threats. The thing is, now you have a situation where people in Yemen can produce cheap drones and such like, and interdict one of the world's major shipping lanes, and take out, with stuff basically built in sheds, the US MQ-9 Reaper, which is the preferred instrument of military domination, the drone. I think they've downed about 14 of these things. 3 in a week the other week. Those things come in at $32 million, and you could take them down with something that costs a few tens of thousands. So it really is causing a major issue in those terms. But it's then, of course, as you say, what's the alternative? We can't.
the system cannot continue to exist. The question is, well, what replaces it?
And that is a big question. And so quickly looking at Ukraine, then, I mean, it is, as you mentioned, it is not actually the real target. The real target is China, and Ukraine is the proxy, isn't it? It is an attempt to stop China from becoming a main imperialist force. How do you see that developing?
Well, the problem they've got, of course, is that you can go through the whole history. I mean, when you saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, of course, the NATO powers or the US actually said to Gorbachev, "Look, we're not going to do it. We're not going to get move forwards or get anybody else to join NATO." And then, of course, suddenly over time, all these countries are then up to the borders of Russia are indicted into NATO quite deliberately in those terms, and obviously sucking in all these different ruling classes, new ruling classes in these various countries. And Ukraine, of course, is, I mean, you get the situation where Victoria Nuland can be found on the internet. On YouTube, actually, boasting about having spent $5 billion on subverting the government of Ukraine through the Euromaidan coup in 2014. She was senior in the US State Department until a few months ago, and actually, this obviously has been a long-term project. I mean, actually going back to the Second World War. I mean. There was a whole crew of Ukrainian fascists carefully stowed away in Canada over decades for future use. Some of their descendants are actually in the Canadian government. So I mean, in those terms, it's a very long-term piece of operation. But it's failed. I mean, it's failed. The imperialists are quite happy to use all sorts of people as cannon fodder, which is what they're doing actually in both Ukraine and Israel. We don't mind, you could find some reactionaries and they can go and be cannon fodder for us, and of course go and kill whoever. But it doesn't solve their issues.
Mm. And the Ukraine maiden coup, you mentioned it shows that it's not just direct coups or sort of assassinations. It's also color revolutions are often part of the arsenal of imperialism in trying to change the world to their liking. I'm going to bring in Ian now. Hi, comrade.
Good evening, comrades. I just wanted to make a couple of short observations about empires in decline. If you look at the decline of the Roman Empire, I'm no expert on it at all, but what you see really is the transition effectively from a Roman or the slave economy of the ancient world to feudalism was a direct consequence of contradictions within the ancient world's slave economy. I mean, if you've got ancient Rome and you're dependent upon slaves, where are you going to get them from? You can only get it from the expansion of the empire. So because their position is analogous to being prisoners of war or whatever. Once you reach the kind of outer limits of what you can maintain as an empire, where do these people come from? And you can't get slaves to work particularly hard. Far better if they could turn them into serfs effectively. So they've got some sort of reason to participate in the system. So you end up with the Roman Empire crumbling because it can no longer maintain that its particular form of political economy. And arguably the same is true of other empires. Also, when empires are in decline, they can be in decline for a very long time, as the Roman Empire was. And even the British Empire, if you look at the decline of that, arguably the British Empire was at its largest in 1919, because it acquired German colonies and so on. But it was arguably in decline even before that. Look at the huge difficulty Britain had in subduing Boer farmers in South Africa. It took something in the region of 250,000 men to subdue what 35,000 Boers and their supporters, and it was only possible to do it with concentration camps and horrors unimaginable up until that point. So arguably, even in the Second Boer War, Britain's decline was already showing itself, despite the fact that it was at the height of empire. Moving on to the United States, one of the things, I mean, one argument is the American empire is not in decline. Why should it be? I mean, it's more powerful than China. It has effectively already got, as you showed in that very good infographic, effectively it's already got China surrounded. But it also raises the question of what we mean by decline, because in the period after the Second World War, with the Cold War in full swing, the United States could quite reasonably say, we are the guardians of freedom, because you had a hugely expanding economy. The Marshall Plan had effectively meant that by the end of the Marshall Plan, most of the countries that had been devastated by World War II were actually producing more than before World War II. So the Marshall Plan was hugely effective in restructuring the economy, and hugely effective actually in stimulating the American economy. And you know, even bizarre examples of America being able to quite reasonably put itself forward as a guardian of freedom against the horrors of Stalinism, whether that's in art or literature or just, you know, personal freedoms. And from that point of view, there was an ideology that was consistent with its position as world hegemon. You know, it was believable. I would argue, but I may be wrong or over optimistic or just being guilty of sort of you know, excessive optimism, that America's standing in the world is now very, very different. You can't look at the United States today and say, this is the guardian of world freedom. It's not lost on anybody what the United States have been doing, particularly since the oil crisis of 1973, and then again in the Iranian Revolution, and ever since, the United States, in order to enforce its position, has had to rely upon naked force in a way in which it didn't particularly in the 1950s or whatever. I mean, okay, yes, there was lots of naked force in Korea, there was lots of naked force in Vietnam, but for the most part, there was, you know, most people didn't really oppose the Vietnam War until the late 1960s. There wasn't much of an opposition to the Korean War. In fact, there wasn't much opposition to apartheid South Africa until fairly late on. And then really, it was with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so from that point of view, the kind of ideology of US imperialism was transformed really by the collapse of Stalinism. And so now it is a kind of reversion to sort of naked class struggle in a sense. And of course, the other aspect was, if you go back to the United States proletariat, was hugely radicalized after World War One, hugely radicalized up to World War One, and to a certain extent after. And of course, that was one of the things that led to the New Deal. And Roosevelt and the New Deal was crucial in incorporating the US proletariat. Where is that now? No one's promising anything of the sort, and things are looking pretty grim for the US working class. So I'm hoping that leads to a revolutionary movement, but at the moment it's not looking terribly optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Matthew, do you want to reply to that?
Yeah, I think the thing is, obviously the decline of the US is quite open. I mean, you can see, I mean, the thing is, obviously, I agree in terms of, you know, the development of a radical working class, which you see, you know, as you say, in the wave coming up to the First World War, which happens you know, across the whole swathe of countries. I mean, you know, Europe, US, Britain. mass right wave and so on, and even into the period post First World War, inspired obviously by the Russian Revolution, and then into the 30s. I mean, the key fight battles in the 30s in the US working class, and even actually post Second World War. I mean, the largest strike in US history is in 1946, but you then have obviously the advent of McCarthyism as part of the whole, the whole clamp down on the left and the working class itself. Due to obviously using the whole question of Stalinism and its unappealing nature, shall we say, as a method of suppressing that left and suppressing the organisation of the working class. The thing is, what they've done now, of course, is to by shifting to finance capital, which of course is completely parasitic, it means that the economy itself, I mean, is visibly declining in those terms, failing to deliver for much of the population. Hence, you get inordinate amounts of discontent, and its use in order, the rise of Trump and so on and so forth. Basically a sort of the far right as a means of drawing off some of that, using some of that extreme discontent. Because obviously the thing about the US also is it's failed to deliver any growth in living standards for the working class. I mean, actual wage labour in the US, the real rate of wages hasn't grown. It's actually been shrinking, certainly since 07, 08, and has been going, was pretty stagnant since the 70s. So in those terms, in working class terms, and in terms of, as I say, the impact of the decline, through finance capital. In 07, 08, essentially, finance capital then blows up in the faces of the ruling class. It doesn't have an answer to that. And what it's done actually is to stuff money, to create money and stuff that in there and hope the hell that makes the difference. And it essentially now is under conditions in which the world banking system is actually now integrated into a single operation. They can't touch any of it. I mean, you have to say that they've just been postponing the crisis. And you can look at things like the career of Alan Greenspan as this great right-wing character who was forced to implement all these state intervention into the economy in order to hold it up, for his entire period of office, which is really very interesting process. They also, of course, keep losing. I mean, the point being, obviously lost the Vietnam War, which is critical, and then of course you see a whole series of other issues. The fact that they basically shoot out of Afghanistan, that they're going to lose in Ukraine, or they have lost in Ukraine, but clearly they're not going to accept that. The question is, what the alternative have they got? The fact that it seems likely they'll lose in the Middle East as well at this point. It really does get to the point where you think, but the key question really is what's the alternative? Is the working class actually going to put itself on the stage? Actually going to pose can the left and the working class actually pose an alternative to this crap? I mean, if you get Trump, it makes it even worse, because obviously then Trump's view is to try and dislocate the entire world economy for the privilege of the US. Rather than run the thing, he'll just smash it up. I mean, if you institute like these huge tariffs and effectively you destroy the system that you've put together in order to run the world, you start smashing up your own, and you're smashing up your own mechanisms of control, which really will create huge issues. Already is. I mean, you already see that, in these terms. I mean, you're saying, you can say also, I mean, the other impact of say the Ukraine war is to destroy large chunks of the European economy, and you can see that the mechanism. Actually, the US destroys, as Seymour Hersh points out, Nord Stream, which is probably the most important, well, is the most important strategic energy supply into Western Europe, comes out of Russia, obviously, and they blow it up, which fucks up, the German economy in particular, but the rest of Europe as well. And you can see that the nature of the relationship between the US and the rest of the imperial powers. The Germans, having had their most strategic energy supply line, which they owned half of, blown up, don't dare mention it. They don't dare say anything about it. It's extraordinary.
Some do in the German parliament. Sarah Wagenknecht, one of the few, and the Alternative for Germany, which is actually why it's quite so popular. It is the main opposition party, which is quite shocking. The right-wing Alternative for Germany party. I just picked you up on something, Matthew. You're saying that and I think, thank you, Ian. I think the question of ideology is actually very important, and ideology around freedom fighters. There was a bit of a discussion in the chat. We're not saying that America has spread freedom. Let's just be quite clear about that. But they were able to, pursue various wars, coups, color revolutions in the name of, democracy against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had turned into a very undemocratic system, the opposite of socialism. Some of us would argue, but we're not saying that they are fighting for freedom or democracy, or have in the past. But just to pick you up there, Matthew, you're saying in Ukraine and Israel, you think the US is losing. I mean, certainly Russia is not winning, and certainly, Israel. I mean, is Israel losing really in the Middle East? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it's quite clear. I mean, the US effectively pledged to fight to the last Ukrainian, and they're now running out of Ukrainians. And the thing is that, I mean, obviously the Russian, at the moment, Russia will grind forwards, et cetera, and the point being is that the Ukrainian regime will, collapse probably. Unless something else happens. I mean, the thing is, I mean, obviously there's going to be a desperate summit of various powers, in terms of what do they do now. Biden is going to be, and they're going to summon all these guys and say, well, what do we do now? And in that, from the position of, otherwise, unless they do something, then it's a question what form does that loss take? In Israel, you can't really see. I mean, the problem is you can't really see. There's no logical basis whereby the Israelis can win at this point. I mean, Israel itself. You've probably got up till the middle of March, I think, which is the last figures I've seen, something like 0.6 million people left. You expect that more people will keep leaving. And it's not a big country in population terms. Israel's always been set up to fight short wars. They never fight long ones in history. They never fought long one because obviously they not have the capacity either from personnel or material to do it. And essentially, the IDF has been saying months ago, look, we have to stop. We just, we're struggling here. They can't. I mean, they can't eliminate. They said, okay, we're going to eliminate Hamas, and they can't do that. Hamas are still issuing videos of them blowing up Israeli armor and the rest of it. Have been for since the very start, and clearly still operate. You think, well, okay, they could. I mean, the only thing that they could do is start a wider war and drag the US into a wider war, and otherwise, they're done. It's just a matter of how. And how long does it take, and how many people do they kill in the process?
Okay, we have one short question, I'm told, by Catherine, if you would like to come in. Hi. You're muted. Sorry, comrade. You need to unmute.
Okay, just a quick thing. I'm not an expert on any of this, but I've been following it. And you've skipped on quite a lot from the question I had, which was in relation to the gradual decline, if you like, of the US hegemony across the world, is how much of an impact does it have? This is an economics question, really. The fact that I think there's something between 33 and $34 trillion of debt within the UK, the US economy at the moment, which sounds a huge amount to me, but it may be. I mean, I think they keep printing money, which is why this is happening. But yeah, just a response, I suppose, from what impact that will have over the next 5 years or so, something, if you can answer that question. I don't know. That's it, really.
Thanks, Catherine. Do you want to try, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously an issue for them. I mean, they keep issuing government debt as well, and there is now sort of some, obviously, if you run a massive deficit all the time in government terms, because obviously they really don't have the ruling class in the US, much of it doesn't want to pay tax. So you wind up in a situation you're issuing all these debt, and the question is who's going to buy it? I mean, traditionally, of course, the Chinese used to buy it. The even going back, the Japanese would buy it, but it's now getting to the point where they say, okay, well, who do we get to buy our debt? Plus, of course, you also got this situation where you have this vast quantity of financial derivatives, which are all basically predicated on future profit of this and that. And as Warren Buffett, of course, who's one of the biggest capitalists in the US, said it's like a bomb under the system, And as you say, I mean, there's vast amounts of debt floating around, and the problem is that can any of it be collected? Plus, of course, you also, which of course then also it again underlines the whole question of the stability of not just the banking system, not just in the US, but of capitalism in general. Because I mean, obviously that is the basic predicate for the crisis of 07-08, when it was quite clear that obviously this debt was crap, and people were being sold rubbish. Therefore, various things collapsed, but none of that's been resolved. They haven't resolved any of it. They just basically patched it up, threw it back in again. Then, and then said, well, if there's any crap, then if anything else happens, then obviously the state will stand as backstop. But I mean, at some point you say, well, is the state good for that? Can the state continue to do that? And we see, I mean, then of course you also see the whole thing with the likes of Silicon Valley Bank or Credit Suisse, which was collapsed, 2022, again, which exposed the sort of systemic issue that they couldn't resolve the banking system. And basically they just said, well, we'll stuff another lot of money into it, give it away to somebody else. In the case of Credit Suisse, of course, they had to be a bit cunning about it. Like they, normally in a collapse of an organization, the bondholders get done. No, sorry, the shareholders get done, and the bondholders are somewhat protected. In the case of Credit Suisse, because the shareholders were Saudi, and the Swiss didn't want to screw the Saudis. They kept the shareholders reasonably whole and screwed the bondholders. But again, you see the system itself could just fall, and it could happen anywhere, because it's basically the whole thing now is one piece, because the banks are so interlinked by all the transactions and holdings, etc., etc. They can't unravel them.
Thank you, Matthew. Peter Kennedy. Hi. Oh, can't hear you. You're unmuted, but your microphone doesn't seem to work. Or maybe you can turn it up. I'm going to bring in Steve and let you try. Okay. Steve Freeman, please.
Thank you, Tina. Maybe I'll start by saying that I think a war between China and America is the inevitable logic of an imperialist system. And as you say, where one power is rising and another power is in decline. And the point about being top dog in this system is it's that you get to make the rules, which everybody else has to abide by. And that's what happened after the Second World War. America made the rules that everybody else, as it were, had to abide by. But if the new kids are coming on the block, the new kids are going to rush up against these rules and ways of trading, and there's going to come a point where they clash and where perhaps there's some war, and if it doesn't kill us all, then there'll be some kind of reset. And they knew if China was to come victorious, then China would decide what sort of currency, and China would decide the new Bretton Woods, etc., etc. That's why that happens. Now, you might say, well, what is America really declining? And is China really rising? And I suppose the root of that has got to be looking back into the mode of exploitation. But basically, because at the end of the day, if China has a better system of raising productivity, albeit it started further back, a long way back from America. It started a long way down the track, but it's catching up as far as I can see, and the way things are going. So if China's got a better system of exploiting wage labor than America, a better system of state direction of capital than the American system, then China's rising and America is seen to be relatively weaker because its system of exploitation isn't really functioning that well. And China sailed through 2007-8, but America didn't, you know. So I think there's evidence to say, because if that wasn't true, if America could keep being more productive than everybody else, nobody would be in a position to challenge them at all. So I think it's predicated on the idea that the lower productivity countries catching up and threatening the dominant productivity economy. Now, I think going back, as Ian said, you know, empires existed way before capitalism. The Roman Empire, the Assyrians, I don't know what else we got, the Babylonians, the Chinese, whatever. The point about Marx and Lenin was that Marx and Lenin, what they did was, and especially Lenin, of course, was to link imperialism to capitalism and to show that capitalism had a certain logic, the logic of the world market, the domination of the world, the transformation of the world into an economy of wage labor and capital. That was the source of imperialism. It was that drive, you know, in other words, the capital's got a drive. It's not humans deciding to go to war, really. It's the logic of the profit system, which the Russian Revolution appeared to knock a hole out of, by the way, and take Russia out of that system. And then, of course, Stalinism got it back in again, you know, came in and reintegrated so that Russia became an imperialist power, in my opinion, at the time of the Second World War, when it appeared to become the second world power, etc., challenging America. So it's important, really, that Lenin's point was imperialism was the most advanced, the most highly developed stage of capitalism. Of course, we've gone on since then. It's not that capitalism stopped in 1917 or we're into an even more bigger stage of capitalism, right? So we're on a higher. If Lenin said it's the higher stage of capitalism, we must be living in the higher and higher stage. I don't know, the extra high stage. I don't know where it would be. But as you say, we've got multinational corporations now. We've got world integration in globalization, world banks, world multinational corporations, the thorough integration of everybody into the world market. So I think if you... For Russia to say that Russia was I'll try to come there. If to say that Russia is an imperialist power, it has at least to be capitalist. If it's not a capitalist country, then it's not part of this the world capitalist system. If it's part of the world system, it doesn't mean it is an imperialist power, but it doesn't even get to first base. It isn't even part of the system. So China, again, if China is not a capitalist country, then it's not in the world. It's outside the system of imperialism, not driven by its logic. And then, of course, imperialism is not purely explained just by being a global system, because it's state imperialism. Amongst all of the countries in the world that are now run by capitalism, some of them become oppressor nations, oppressor states with this military power to dominate the world, and others are oppressed nations. So a lot of the capitalist countries are oppressed and oppressor nations, and it's that political relationship between them. I guess you need to have nuclear weapons to be an imperialist power in this world. You know, but you have to have productivity, you have to have banks and all those other things, but you have to have military power and you have to have nuclear weapons. I think that's essential to do that. I'll stop there. Just one other point. I won't to the point. Of course, there's a counter theory that says because of globalization, the world is so integrated, all the capitalist countries, China and America, are so connected together that they can't have a war because they would damage each other so badly it's not in their interest to have a war. In other words, when you get to super globalization, you go beyond imperialism and you get to a kind of peaceful capitalism. Now, obviously, I don't accept that, but I'm just saying there was always that idea that we got into a post-imperialist world because of globalization, etc., etc. I'll finish there.
That's an old one, though, isn't it, Steve?
It
That
is.
was Kautsky in 1914.
Of course, yeah, no. all the,
Well,
Tina, all the old stories come back again. That's the point. They get revived and they find another expression in a later period. You're absolutely right. It's not a new story, but I believe you'll see some. I personally believe that Hillel Tickton argued that in Communist University one time. I seem to recall. But anyway, let's not.
Probably not anymore, I would hope. That seems a bit daft. I mean, it's an interesting question, though, isn't it? The relationship between capitalism and imperialism. Can you be capitalist but not imperialist? And let's say if Russia and China are not imperialist in our definition, does that mean we have to support them in any forthcoming wars, which I think a lot of lefties get into, and I think they're getting themselves into quite the muddle over that one. What do you think, Matthew?
Well, I think the thing is, I mean, I think this is an arguable point. I mean, the interesting thing, of course, is that Russia, I mean, clearly isn't imperialist, but that's a different argument. Certainly not when it was when certainly the USSR and Stalinism wasn't imperialist. I mean, it wasn't capitalist. I mean, clearly, I mean, didn't have money. There was exploitation of labor, very crude basis. It certainly wasn't capitalist. But it's in those terms. I mean, you can actually probably describe Russia as not fully capitalist, although of course, obviously, it does have capitalists in it. The same thing in Chinese terms. I mean, interesting. I mean, you've got this very odd hybrid operation because the state maintains control of very large chunks of the economy. Well, either by direct, ownership or whatever else, or just by the fact it can direct them. I mean, okay, you've got billionaires and so on in China. I mean, it's clearly not anything to do with socialism, but it also, the state is able to direct, the economy to a very large extent. So thus, they are actually able to bail out through that. Actually, able to bail out the world economy 07, 08 by running a construction boom, laid down more concrete than ever been seen in human history, which essentially reflated the world economy. Hence, Stalinism props up capitalism. But clearly some very odd characteristics within it. I mean, you could, again, I mean, you look at the attitude of Chinese to like South Africa. That's almost straight up imperialism. I mean, it's some very odd, as I say, very odd characteristics. And really, you need to look at that further. But really, what you're talking about is also, of course, is an actual decline in all aspects of the US. Whether that's production, whether that's social function, whether that's all the mechanisms that it's put together. Instead of actually having those operating properly, of course, it's actually spending its time damaging them. In order to try and preserve itself, it's actually damaging the structures that allow it to work in the world, and to all these things that have been put together. Excuse me. So really, you can see. I mean, it is in a dire state, and I mean, exemplified, of course, by Trump. Because and the people around him. I mean, you can see. I mean, it is a variety of lunacy. Which is a method. I mean, there's a method of obviously of social control, but it's really strange. I mean, it includes sort of a really crazy version of misogyny, racism, as you might expect, and basically then also even damaging the function of their own economy. I mean, if they fling out, or if Trump attempts to fling out, 13 million or whatever undocumented people, I mean, it would destroy in huge areas of the US economy, which run on those people, the likes of agriculture or construction, or all these sectors, all basically, and numbers of other sectors, in fact, are dependent on those guys. And it's extraordinary as a means of trying to run to operate a system, and just as you say, the degree of crisis within it.
Can I just make a little point, Tina? I know other people waiting, but I'll make a very small point. For me, if you want to look at capital, you've got to look at wage labor, really. So China's become a wage labor economy. It started out as if you like, a peasant economy, and it's become a wage labor economy. That is the mode by which the vast bulk of people earn their living, being employed by somebody or other. And that somebody, whoever it is exploiting them, whether that's multinationals or the state or whatever. But that's what you have to look at. That's wage labor. We're talking about wage labor economies. That's the best way to see it. And just one other final point. We mustn't mix up colonialism with imperialism, because colonialism was a form of imperialism where you went to a country and set up a state there and then ran the state and extracted everything by controlling India, let's say, for example. Modern imperialism doesn't need to do that. It does it with multinational corporations and banks. It has different ways of exploiting profit than the old, more primitive idea of colonialism, which was a kind of imperialism, don't get me wrong, but it is not to be equated with it.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
It's a difficult question, of course, the nature of Russia and China, and things are changing dramatically in this period. I think that is the key, that we're in transition. These states, these regimes are in transition, and they certainly want to be capitalist. They certainly want to be imperialist, but perhaps they're not quite there yet. Peter, do you think your microphone works now? Yes, it does.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Hi.
Oh, yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, just a question and then some kind of reflections. The question is, with the emphasis on imperialism, the US imperialism, that you presented, I'm wondering, what the relationship is with finance capital, because are we saying that, what we're not saying, obviously, from what you've said, is that we live in the same world as Lenin and Trotsky and, that era, because they talked about competing imperialist powers with their own finance capitalist class, mobilizing imperialist policies and capital investments and trying to carve the world up and all the rest of it based on that. So you're obviously saying that America is the top dog now, top imperialist power, and others are sub-imperialists, especially those in the West, Germany, Italy, France, much of the OECD, and major economies, except maybe China and Russia are outliers. They seem to be sub-imperialist powers, but of the sort that are not, are seen as rivals with America, rather than being under the umbrella or under the thumb of America, through all the institutions that you pointed out, Matthew. So, it's a different world, and I suppose America's been given the task of overseeing decline, and I know you, go along with the idea of decline as I do, and so. And the question is, what is the relationship with imperialism as it is now, with American dominance and its military power and finance capital? Because what I can see around the globe in terms of, the production, in terms of finance, is the interpenetration. So there's a lot of foreign direct investment, from America into China, from China into Europe and into America, and crisscrossing about the world. So there's a kind of a global reach, if you like, of foreign direct investment, and they're in the classical imperialist powers too. So they're all capital is being invested in mainly in the core powers around the world. And that's distinctly different. And so that means that investment is global. And finance is certainly global because of, the major financial institutions of the world, including banking and pension funds, insurance funds. Although they may have origins, still head offices in particular nations, they do operate globally and see their interest in a global sense. So that leads me to ask whether you agree with this then, as I pose the question, that American imperialism, as the dominant imperialist power, is being given the task of kind of coordinating that global financial spectrum, And you mentioned before about finance capital being not just financial institutions, but it's penetration of non-financial organizations, in other words, large corporations, which do the foreign direct investment. So there's a penetration there. And, the interesting thing as well, you probably know as well, is just how much money from finance capital has been ploughed into the military, the global military industrial complex around the world, the arms industry, and which is promoting war because it makes money from the sales and it wants to expand military production. So there's that kind of thing, and I don't like make any excuses for being clear about that, because it's a mess at the moment, isn't it? Because it is in decline. Trying to pick out where the nations stand in this, where the global aspects are. But my other point of reflection is what is this kind of set to against America and China, say, all about? Because if you look at China, it owns vast amounts of debt in America, the bonds in America. If it pulled out, America would collapse financially, the currency would go. So its interests lie with America in that respect, as foreign direct investments, as I already said, in America. And most of its growth has depended on large swathes of capital from America. So when we say one country's got higher productivity than another, then it's not because they have a secret formula. It's because labor's cheap in different parts of the world where foreign direct investment has gone, and malleable, and the state's malleable, and so they can extract a higher rate of intense workflows, and so productivity from, and it's labor intensive as well. So that's a line into being more productive. And obviously the capital investment, it increases the productive powers of labor over time. But when you look at China, it's a kind of small fish, isn't it, when it comes to imperialism even. So it's not a threat. It is an imperialist power, but a sub-imperialist power. And its growth over the past 2 decades or more has been because of global finance and capital going into China. So there's an interest. So there's an interest of the core economies in the West who say they're opposed to China in propping up China. So my question is, I'm putting this together with the overarching scheme that this is all happening with the process of capitalist decline, right? So my question is, are they trying to, is American imperialism in the West trying to change China so that it can develop a thoroughgoing, revamping of the economy there, and Russia too, and other parts of the world, so that it can find a new, their strategy of accumulation, and so overcome its decline? Or is that not possible? And if it is not possible, what is going on with because they don't seem very threatened in a political sense, in a kind of militarily sense, from China, and certainly not economic for reasons that I've just pointed out, because the interpenetration. So my only thought is that, well, maybe capitalist decline can be arrested, and reversed. And maybe that's a strategy where some of that portion of the world now can be revised, remodeled, re-engineered after crushing that part of the world and instituting a new regime of accumulation. I don't know. But it seems to me it can't. We're talking about capitalist decline. So is it just another horrible situation whereby a declining system does irrational things, and America must maintain its global control, and that it simply means threatening and putting into place now and again those states that become a bit more uppity and start to challenge maybe trade policies, trade flows, and all the rest of it, and the balance of payments for America. I don't know, but anyway, I'll leave it at that. Complex.
Yes, big question. I'm not sure if Matthew has the answer, but try.
I think there's a number of aspects to that. I mean, the thing is, obviously, if you look at it, the relationship between China and the US is complex. I mean, obviously, arising out of, as I say, the effort by the US to Nixon to do a deal with China, and they're which led to a relatively long-term relationship, in which, I mean, there was a considerable intellectual back and forth, and people, they were being nice to the Chinese, and they brought them large numbers of folk from China to study in US universities, etc., etc. And I mean, the thing was obviously the effort to integrate China into the US system, and they allowed them into World Trade Organization and all this sort of stuff. But clearly, the Chinese view was that they weren't going to allow the Americans to take over. They weren't going to say, okay, we'll be subject to your, you running this economy as a sub-economy, or a sub part of your own. And the other point that's also happened, of course, is that huge amounts of manufacturing, of course, has been shed. In the process of the decline and move to financialization across Europe and the US has been shed into China. In some cases, they actually just took the entire machinery, literally took entire factories and exported them to China. Where, of course, I mean, originally what happened was the use of more labor, because obviously Chinese labor was cheap. And you could do the same process, but you did it with labor rather than necessarily machines. Now, obviously, that changed round, and the thing is, the Chinese regime has actually said, okay, we're going to go to move towards technology. And okay, that's not what they've done the entire economy, but in fact, what they've now got is a situation in which the Chinese economy, technologically, in some sectors, some key sectors, is actually in advance of the US economy. And you can see that, as I say, in telecommunications, in terms of certainly all the sort of renewables tech. Certainly in terms of some of the basic even extractive stuff like rare earth metals is a complete lock. Chinese EVs are electric vehicles are street ahead of what's coming out of as I say, the automotive companies in the West are terrified because the Chinese have got better cars at lower cost. Their technology is better. And it's not just a question of lower cost, it's actually technology. There's a technological advantage. So in those terms, it's quite deliberate. The problem we've got, of course, is that the response, of course, of the Americans in particular has been to try and cut off the access of China to tech, and to say that you can't that they can't make not allowed attempt to stop China making the top level electronic stuff. So they put the screw. Actually, of course, the world economy, of course, now relies upon basically now monopoly. So the monopoly on manufacturing a gear for making chips is in one company in the US, in the Netherlands. So basically, the US is where you can't export those anywhere near China. Not allowed into China. So you're forcing the Chinese to build their own stuff. The other thing, of course, the problem the US has got is actually the main country using that tech is Taiwan. It's not the Americans. This is the effort. Biden's effort through the CHIPS Act was to try and say, well, relocate your production of this high-end electronics into the US, and it's unclear whether that work. It looks unlikely. So in those terms, it's not straightforward at all. So I mean, I think that the other thing, of course, is that the Americans, of course, are very fond of wars. They've always been at war. They love wars. They see that as being one of their principal methods. So if you look at, say, the relationship with Russia, for instance, I mean, the Russians were quite. I mean, they actually pulled the Russians into G8 at one point. There was a G8 including Russia. And there was a deal, and there was conversations between Russia and Russian military, NATO, and all this sort of stuff. So, and that was deliberately broken, by the US. And it's deliberately been a case of, well, okay, actually, of course, as looking at say the work of Zbigniew Brzezinski, of course, the Great Game. Basically, he sets forward, I mean, the idea of the US of breaking Russia into small bits, because obviously it's easy to control. But of course, that Russia's not going to do that. They're not going to allow that. So and then you wind up with this situation we've got of an assortment of wars and the potential of war with China. So I mean, and also the other thing, of course, is that as you say, the other point, of course, is that world production is now integrated. It is integrated across the world, and it becomes an issue in terms of can you operate, because it's now basically breaking the boundaries of the nation state and the methods of control and so on. I mean, if you go back to Trump's first time round, they said, well, can we find an American car? They couldn't. There isn't such a thing. It doesn't exist because all the vehicles or vehicle production is integrated across the world. As the production of most things is now. There isn't. There really can't have autarky of any sort. So in those terms, the political controls and controls of production by the ruling class becomes very, very difficult.
Thank you. I hope that kind of answered it. It is a tricky question. I certainly think that, as Matthew said, Russia and China were actually closer in the past, weren't they, to US imperialism, and when they become a danger, being pushed away, and there's an attempt to control them, I think, these wars for sure, and to exploit them better. John.
Thanks, Tina. Yeah, I want to make one short point and two longer ones. The first one is that British imperialism ruled very well, had a guiding ideology, and a large part of that was racism. The American empire after World War II set out not to rule in that way. In fact, a lot of its propagandist stuff aimed at Britain and France in the 20th century was about this and being anti-racist. However, America, the USA, like Israel, is a country which is founded on racism and which developed into a continent-wide power through racism and via racism, and remains racist, which is why we had the Jim Crow laws even after the abolition of slavery, which is why we had to have a massive civil rights movement in the 1960s, and why even that is not enough. And so that is something which has crept up on America and which has destabilized its legitimacy in the rest of the world. And now, of course, we have the genocide in Palestine, which raises the whole issue of American racism again, because of its complicity in that, and the way in which the Israelis have waged that war ideologically against not just Palestinians, but all Arabs and all Muslims. My two points of, I suppose, contention. One is over when America decided to ditch its guardianship of the free world rhetoric and that particularly ideological way of ruling the world. And I don't think they chose to ditch it. And I don't think it was either after Vietnam or after the collapse of the USSR. Because if you remember, back in the 1990s, they formulated this concept of humanitarian warfare. The idea of humanitarian warfare was to, through war, destroy reactionaries and evildoers, and actually put a better world in shape. Now, that was the whole ideology behind the NATO bombing of Serbia, and the way in which both America and Britain and other European countries conducted themselves over the Balkans in the 1990s. And it was continued even after the attack on the Twin Towers, and the world supposedly changed. Because the war in Libya was very much predicated on the basis that there was going to be a genocide in Benghazi carried out by the Gaddafi regime, which was a complete myth, but it served to justify the replacement of that regime and the turning of Libya into a lawless country run by warlords, pretty much like many of the others that imperialism has visited. So I don't see that as something which America chose. I see that as something which was changed for America by the rise of Al-Qaeda and then ISIL. Secondly, you haven't mentioned, Matthew, and neither has Ian in either of his two talks so far, cultural imperialism. And cultural imperialism, I think, takes several forms since the Second World War. It's partly about the English language and the use of American English increasingly, and it becoming a global language. Secondly, it's about the whole advertising and ideological component of American exports, which were selling a lifestyle choice to the rest of the world. And thirdly, it was educational, in that, as well as the existing British Council and the work that it did on behalf of soft imperialism, if you like, the Americans too had these various American schools set up throughout the world, where members of the elite and often the upper middle class of various societies around the world would be educated in the American school. Now, those haven't gone away. Those haven't gone away. Some of that structure, like as you've said, a consequence of what you have said about the American economy dipping, is that it no longer exports as much around the world, together with the messages that go with those exports. So it can't do that to the same extent, but to a large extent, I think that is still intact, that system of cultural imperialism. you know, you see it in textiles and the English language, things that go on, the logos, the messages, and so on. The Western music is another aspect of that. And I think this offers them some degree of protection so I don't think we should be so confident in saying that now the global south in particular, and the BRICS countries as well, are do no longer accept American ideology. I think that parts of that are still intact, and the Chinese don't seem to be exporting, along with their economic penetration of especially Africa. They don't seem to be exporting an alternative ideological message, as far as I know, but I don't speak Mandarin. They may be, for all I know. But those are my two main points about humanitarian war in the 1990s and in the noughties as well in Libya, which I think was a bit of an overhang. I think there was a change that took place with the Twin Towers, and from then on, and we're still in that era really of imperialism and, if you like, endless war, endless imperialist war. But I would question that the way in which America had its ideological message changed, and secondly, I think that there are implications as soon as we start considering the cultural aspect of imperialism as well.
Thank you, John. Matthew.
Yeah, okay, just to agree. I think the thing is, obviously, the problem for the ruling class, of course, is that in capitalism, of course, is that it's relatively small and it requires any means of splitting the working class it can get. So racism is a principal capitalist instrument. There is no, I mean, racism, you know, capitalism is racist. I mean, you could posit a non-racist capitalism, but it doesn't exist. Same, I mean, actually the same with misogyny, and it becomes increasingly more the case, actually, you know, as we see some of the crazy stuff that's been put out in the US these days, nakedly misogynistic, it's unbelievable stuff. But I think, you know, in terms of what you're saying about the whole thing about the, you know, the free world, I think the problem becomes, of course, is that, I mean, when it's exposed just how badly the Americans have behaved in various parts, you know, Iraq, you know, and the wars that they've carried out, Afghanistan, you know, and then, of course, obviously the low point, really, of course, the naked embrace of torture. I mean, obviously, the Americans and the British and so on will always use torture, but they usually get some deniable subcontractors to do it for them, and maintain their distance from it. Come to you know, the time of you know, Bush Jr., of course, and they decided that they were going to do this, and the entirety of the CIA decided that you know, enthusiastically torturing people in across the world, you know, was the way to operate, you know. Plus, then, of course, obviously, you've also got a situation in which now it's become, because obviously the other point is that the imperialists are now destroying entire countries, as they've done. You know, we can see Libya, we can see Iraq, we can see, you know, even much of Syria, around the world. You know, countries being absolutely flattened, destroyed by these conflicts, and it makes it very difficult to say, well, we have anything to do with freedom or interests, you know, in terms of the eyes of the world. And we can see it even more so in terms of, you know, obviously the fact that, you know, some very brave and Palestinian journalists are writing, you know, putting a genocide up on social media hour by hour, you know, which is clearly being carried out by, you know, Joe Biden as much as it is Netanyahu. it's quite absolutely plain to everybody as to what that is. And I think in terms of, you know, the sort of cultural thing, you're right. But it's then, you know, it still exists. And the thing is, obviously, that this is the mechanism of the imperialists. Is, you know, the US imperialism is different from colonialism in that it requires to have, you know, an fiat comprador layer or ruling class in most areas of the world. So obviously, those people have to be you know, pulled in terms of, you know, an affinity to the US and so on. So and that's extremely important. I mean, I think, you know, you could further explore the whole question of, you know, the you know, culture and music in the US, because obviously there's some deep contradictions in there, but I don't have to.
Thanks, John. Last speaker with a hand up is Sandy. Hi.
Hi there. Just a few points I'd like to make. One is that from what Matthew said, and also from my readings, we really only have one imperialist power, and that's a power centred in the USA. They really control the world imperialist system. The other states are subordinate to the USA and really follow the USA's lead. It's the world's policeman, or as the Iranian regime call it, the Great Satan. And I think there's certainly some truth in that, but they are the world imperialist power. I don't think it's correct to say Russia's an imperialist power. I think you would, if you do have that view, you would have to point to a point where it became an imperialist power, what, 2000, 2008, 2014? I don't know. It doesn't seem to me. It's certainly not integrated into the imperialist power that's controlled by the USA. And remember, that imperialist power has bases throughout the world, as the CIA throughout the world has infiltrated the various ruling classes, has a tremendous cultural control as well, and dictates to the third world, what we used to call the third world, what its economies can do. They can't grow food, they can grow cash exports, so they're kept under the heel of imperialism and they can be sanctioned. And the USA uses sanction to help control the parts of the world that imperialism dominates. I do think that Russia is not dominated. I mean, there seemed to have been an attempt under Yeltsin and after Yeltsin, when the Russians wanted to be integrated into the American imperialist system, and the Americans wouldn't do that. They wouldn't allow them to be integrated on a kind of equal basis. It was a question of they were going to be completely subordinate, and it looked as if they were actually going to be broken up, and all their industry was going to be destroyed under the kind of crash program in the 90s. And Putin was a reaction to that. So I don't think it's correct to say Russia's imperialist. In fact, I think Russia is fighting imperialism. And that's why, I mean, I disagree with those comrades that take a kind of equivocal position on the Ukraine war. I think we should be for the defeat of NATO, for the defeat of Ukraine, and for a victory for Russia, because I think that would be a blow for the working class of the world, a big step forward to see the defeat. Because remember, the America is the world power that intervenes through South America, Africa, Asia, etc., to try and crush any move towards one working class power, but even towards independence, where countries can develop themselves. And it is interesting to note, if you discuss the decline since finance capital was in power, if you look at the neoliberal policies followed both in Britain and the US, the infrastructure is collapsing. They're not investing in education, they're not investing in roads, rail, they're not investing in the infrastructure. Compare that with China, where I think, again, we're not talking about finance capital being in power in China, putting tremendous resources into developing infrastructure that allows their economy to draw, 800 million people out of extreme poverty. That's not happened anywhere else in the third world. You needed a revolution to overthrow the capitalist class before that could happen. And I think that, although they obviously don't support the Stalinist regime there, I think it's very different from the regimes that we have in Western Europe, America, etc. And you can see that by the rising standards of living of the Chinese people. So I think it's important. And the other thing is, if you look at Iran, China, Russia, these powers are not under the control of the USA, and the USA want to dominate the whole planet. They want to get their hands on the natural resources. They want to destroy any potential companies that will challenge the American monopolies. And that's really what it's about. It's a world chessboard, and they're trying to bring Russia, Iran, China under the domination of imperialism. And I think in that situation, for instance, where Israel and possibly US attacks Iran, we should be clearly for hands off Iran and for victory to Iran over these forces, just like for the victory of the Palestinian people. That doesn't mean we give support to the regime in Iran or the support to Putin or Xi Jinping. We don't give support to these leaderships, but we give support to the people who are struggling to improve their living standards against the repression that's meted out to them by the USA, the sanctions and the bombings, etc. America seems to be bombing a different country every week. So that would be my position. And I think that once you see imperialism as a bloc with the USA as its head, you do see the need for anti-imperialist alliances with the working class trying to take the lead. But we do want to support those other forces that are fighting the democratic fight for self-determination against imperialist control. Thanks.
Well, the big one last. Thank you. Thank you, Sandy. I mean, that is an important question, isn't it? I mean, I'm not sure personally how you can call for the victory of Russia without supporting Putin, etc. I find that a very dubious position. It would no doubt weaken imperialism if Russia wins, but would it strengthen the working class? I think that is the crucial question. Matthew, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the thing is, it's quite clear that Ukraine has lost. And the thing is, I mean, in those terms, it's what NATO or the Americans decide to do now, and they're, as I say, they're about to have a conference about that, which could be quite terrifying because it could wind up with a general war. I mean, the interesting thing here, of course, is that, I mean, all of these regimes actually would quite happily do a deal with the US. I mean, the Russians quite happy to do a deal with the US, provided it's something that they could live with, not get broken up into small bits. The Iranians, of course, would be quite desperate. I mean, the Iranians are quite desperate to do a deal with the imperialists. They were offered one, and they, in 2015, and they took it quite happily. It was Trump that threaded it. In those terms, so it's almost like, and again, you can see that also say the Iraq War. I mean, Saddam was a CIA man. It's quite strange. I mean, Americans, have this thing, for running wars against even their own operatives, again, I mean, the thing of China, I think, as I say, it's a different debate. I think is about the nature of China. It's unresolved in those terms, and I think that it's not fully capitalist, but it clearly has very great capitalist characteristics. I mean, it's also highly indebted, the same as the US. I mean, possibly not quite to the degree, but certainly highly indebted, and of course dependent on its property sector for a large chunk of its economy as well. Much of which is being propped up, in an effort to try and stop it from dropping off the map. So there's all these things thrown in there, all these different factors thrown in there. So I don't think it's not very, very clear. But the central point, I think, here under these conditions, is the lack of a serious workers' movement, of the working class actually saying, well, requirement for a serious revolutionary left with a serious base in the working class. And there is an alternative to all this crap. The fact that these people are trying to destroy large sections of humanity, if not the world itself, and we require something different. And here it is. And that really is the point at under the circumstance, I think, which is critical.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thanks, Sandy. We don't have time for any more questions now. Sorry, Steve, I know you've got your hand up, but you've had your bite of the cherry. I think there was a very wide-ranging debate, perhaps not clarified all issues because they are very difficult to clarify and they are in flux. This is a period of great flux politically, internationally, but we'll continue to discuss these issues. And there's of course a question what it means in terms of our tactics. Does that mean even if Russia is anti-imperialist or non-imperialist, does it mean we have to support Russia or have call for a victory of Russia? I mean, it's personally, I don't think so. Other comrades have other opinions, but it's good to have those discussions. So thank you for joining us, comrades. Thank you for your introduction as well, Matthew. Very interesting and enjoyable. Next week, October the 24th, Peter Kennedy, who spoke earlier, will be addressing the next session on the ideological role of the expanding post-school education industry in the context of a declining capitalism. So we are coming back to the question of imperialism and ideology, which I think was a very interesting subject we discussed tonight as well. The week after, then we'll again coming back to the mini-series on imperialism with Mike McNair, who's going to look on contemporary imperialism and the problem with Lenin. That should be interesting, something a little bit controversial.